Lyra didn't know that the man who found her hidden in the castle's forgotten library was the most powerful alpha in 5 kingdoms. She didn't know that his searching golden eyes could command armies with a glance, or that nobles trembled when he spoke their names, and she certainly didn't know that the moment he saw her curled between dusty tomes and flickering candlelight, reading poetry by stolen flame, he felt something in his chest crack open like ice breaking under spring sun. The ancient library's forgotten alcove had become her sanctuary. Every evening, after the endless cruelties of serving her step-family, Lyra would slip through shadows and climb the winding stone stairs to this corner where towering shelves created walls of leather-bound safety. Here, surrounded by volumes no one had touched in decades, she could disappear completely. Here, she could breathe. Tonight she'd chosen Keats, the worn pages soft between her fingers as candlelight danced across verses about beauty and truth. Her stepmother's harsh words from dinner still echoed. Worthless, burdensome, taking up space meant for better people. But here in the golden glow, those cruel voices felt impossibly distant. This was her ritual, her escape, her small rebellion against a world that insisted she was nothing. The footsteps came slowly, deliberately, echoing off stone walls like measured heartbeats. Lyra froze, breath catching as the steady rhythm grew closer. No one came to this part of the castle. No one even knew it existed, except her and the dust motes that danced in afternoon sunbeams. Her candle flickered as the footsteps stopped just beyond the towering shelf that shielded her alcove. Silence stretched between them like a held breath, and she pressed herself deeper into the corner, praying the shadows would swallow her completely. "What are you reading?" The voice was deep, warm, genuinely curious rather than accusatory. It held no anger, no demand for explanation or apology for her presence, just simple interest, as if finding someone hidden in forgotten corners was the most natural thing in the world. Lyra's hands trembled as she looked up from her book. A man stood at the entrance to her sanctuary, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing simple dark clothing that somehow managed to look elegant. His hair was dark as midnight, and when her eyes met his, she felt something impossible flutter in her chest. Golden eyes studied her with an intensity that should have terrified her, but instead made her feel seen in a way she'd never experienced. Her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Poetry, just old poetry." He stepped closer, and she noticed he moved with predatory grace, every gesture controlled and purposeful. But when he spoke again, his tone held only gentle interest. "Keats?" Her surprise must have shown on her face, because he smiled then, devastating and warm. "When he shall die, take him and cut him out in little stars, and he will make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night." His voice caressed the familiar words, speaking them from memory with perfect cadence. "That's Shakespeare," she breathed, then flushed at her boldness in correcting a stranger. "Romeo and Juliet." His smile widened, approving. "Testing me?" "No, She fumbled with the book, pages rustling. "I know the difference. I read them both, all the time, and people think because I'm—" She stopped herself before admitting what she was. "A servant, nothing, beneath notice." "Because you're what?" His voice had gone softer, inviting confidence. "Young. Unimportant. They think I can't understand real literature." Something flickered in those golden eyes, something that looked almost like anger, but not directed at her. "What else do you read here in your sanctuary?" The word sanctuary fell from his lips like benediction, and she felt tears prick at her eyes. No one had ever called her hiding place something beautiful before. "Everything," she admitted, gesture encompassing the shelves around them. "History, philosophy, stories about brave people doing impossible things." He settled onto the small bench across from her alcove with fluid grace, and she realized he intended to stay. "And what draws you to brave people doing impossible things?" The question hung between them, weighted with meaning she couldn't quite grasp. Lyra studied his face in the candlelight. Strong jawline, aristocratic nose, eyes that seemed to hold centuries of secrets. He could have demanded answers, ordered her from this place, called guards to remove her for trespassing. Instead, he waited with infinite patience for her to decide whether to trust him. "Because," she said finally, voice growing steadier, "they prove that ordinary people can become extraordinary. That being born nothing doesn't mean you have to stay nothing." "You think you're nothing?" The question was quietly spoken, but felt like thunder in the intimate space. Something in his expression had shifted, become more intense, more focused on her face, as if memorizing every detail. "I am nothing," she corrected gently. "Just a servant girl who hides in libraries." "No." The single word held such quiet conviction that she blinked in surprise. Nothing doesn't read Keats by candlelight. Nothing doesn't understand the difference between Shakespeare and romantic poetry. Nothing doesn't dream of impossible bravery. He leaned forward slightly, golden eyes holding hers. "You're not nothing, Lyra." Her breath caught. "How do you know my name?" For a moment something unreadable crossed his features, but then he smiled that devastating smile again. "I make it my business to know the people who matter in this castle." "But I don't matter. I'm not important at all." "I think," he said softly, rising to his feet with that same fluid grace, "you might be surprised by how wrong you are about that." He moved toward the alcove entrance, but paused, turning back to study her face one more time. "I'm Adrian. By the way." "Just Adrian?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. His smile turned mysterious. "For now, just Adrian is enough." He glanced around the alcove, taking in the scattered candles, the makeshift reading nest she'd created, the careful way she'd arranged everything to be invisible from outside. "This is a beautiful sanctuary. I hope you'll feel safe here always." Something in his tone made it sound like a promise, like a vow spoken before witnesses. Before she could ask what he meant, he'd disappeared back into the shadows between the shelves, leaving only the echo of footsteps and the lingering scent of something warm and cedar-like. Lyra sat in the flickering candlelight, book forgotten in her lap, staring at the spot where he'd stood. Her hands were trembling, but not from fear. Something golden and warm had unfurled in her chest during their conversation, something that felt dangerously like hope. She pressed her fingers to her racing heart and whispered his name into the silence. "Adrian." The candle flame danced as if in answer, and for the first time in years Lyra felt like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as invisible as she'd always believed. 3 days passed before Lyra found the courage to return to the library. 3 days of wondering if she'd imagined the golden-eyed stranger, if the conversation had been nothing more than exhaustion-induced fantasy. 3 days of carrying his voice in her memory like a secret treasure. When she finally climbed the winding stone stairs and slipped into her alcove, her breath caught. There, arranged carefully on her makeshift reading table, lay 3 leather-bound volumes she'd never seen before. Poetry collections, their spines gleaming with gold lettering that caught the candlelight like scattered stars. A folded note rested atop the books, written in elegant script that made her stepmother's careful penmanship look clumsy by comparison. "For someone who appreciates beauty in forgotten places, A." Lyra's fingers trembled as she lifted the first volume. Byron. The second, Shelley. The third, a collection of Celtic love poetry so old the leather binding had gone soft as silk. These weren't common books found in any castle library. These were treasures, the kind of rare volumes that nobles guarded jealously in private collections. She spent the next hour searching through the castle's main library, questioning every servant she encountered. Who had access to such books? Who might know someone with the initial A? The answers came back the same each time. Confused shrugs, blank stares, suggestions that perhaps she'd misremembered where she'd found them. But the books were real, solid and warm beneath her hands as she carried them back to her sanctuary. real as the memory of his voice speaking Shakespeare in the candlelit darkness. "You came back." This time his approach had been silent, and Lyra looked up from Byron's verses to find Adrian standing at the entrance to her alcove. Tonight he wore different clothes, still simple, but she noticed the fabric was finer than she'd first realized, the cut more precise than anything a common man might afford. Moonlight from the high windows cast silver across his dark hair, and those impossible golden eyes seemed to glow in the soft light. "I wasn't certain you would," he continued, settling onto the bench with that fluid grace she remembered. "Not after I startled you so thoroughly. You brought me books." The words came out softer than she'd intended, touched with wonder. "Why?" "You seemed hungry for them, not just the reading, but for beauty itself. I thought perhaps you might enjoy having choices." Lyra traced the gilded letters on Byron's spine, still hardly believing they were real. "These must have cost a fortune. I can't accept gifts this valuable from a stranger." "Can't you?" Adrian leaned forward, studying her face with that same intense focus that made her feel simultaneously exposed and cherished. "Tell me why not." "Because I have nothing to offer in return. Because people don't give precious things to servants. Because—" She struggled for words that wouldn't reveal too much of her shame. "Because I'm not worth the expense." Something dangerous flickered across Adrian's features, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. When he spoke, his voice held carefully controlled gentleness. "Who taught you that?" The question hung between them like a challenge, and Lyra found herself answering despite every instinct screaming to keep her pain private. "Everyone. My step-family mostly. They took me in when my mother died, but they made certain I understood it was charity, that I should be grateful for kitchen scraps and attic rooms and hand-me-down dresses that never fit properly." "Your mother?" Adrian's voice had gone softer, inviting confidence. "She was a seamstress, beautiful, gentle, loved stories and poetry just like these." Lyra gestured to the books around them. "She used to read to me every night before bed, said that words were magic and books were doorways to better worlds. When she died of fever, my stepmother said such nonsense had filled my head with ideas above my station." "And you believed her?" "Shouldn't I have? Look at me." Lyra gestured to her simple brown dress, her work-rough hands, her hair braided back severely. "I live in the servants' quarters, scrub floors, take orders from women who treat their horses better than they treat me. What else would you call that besides knowing my place?" Adrian was quiet for a long moment, golden eyes studying her face with an expression she couldn't read. When he finally spoke, his voice held conviction that made her chest tighten with something dangerously like hope. "I would call that surviving until something better comes along." Before she could respond, he rose fluidly and disappeared into the shadows between the shelves. Lyra sat alone, heart racing from his words, until the sound of returning footsteps echoed through the stone corridors. Adrian reappeared carrying a silver tray laden with food that made her stomach clench with sudden hunger. Roasted chicken still steaming, fresh bread with real butter, fruits that must have cost more than she earned in a month, and delicate pastries she'd only ever seen from a distance at noble feasts. "When did you last eat?" he asked, setting the feast before her with careful precision. "This morning, breakfast." The lie came automatically. She'd learned long ago that admitting hunger only invited lectures about gratitude and knowing her place. "Lyra." Her name on his lips held gentle reproof. "When did you really last eat?" Heat flooded her cheeks. "Yesterday, noon." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "And before that?" "It doesn't matter. I'm used to it, and there's always enough eventually." "That's not what I asked." Adrian settled back onto the bench, golden eyes holding hers with quiet intensity. "How often do they feed you properly?" The question was asked with such genuine concern that Lyra felt tears prick at her eyes. Most days, sometimes they forget, or they're angry about something I've done wrong, or they're entertaining and need all the good food for guests. They withhold food as punishment. Something in his tone made her look up sharply. Adrian's expression had gone carefully neutral, but she caught a glimpse of something cold and dangerous in those golden depths before he mastered it. "It's not cruel," she said quickly, defending people who'd never defended her. "It's just discipline, teaching me responsibility." "Eat." The single word held quiet command, but when she hesitated, his voice gentled. "Please, let me watch you enjoy something beautiful." Lyra reached for the bread first, tearing off a small piece and savouring the way real butter melted on her tongue. The taste was so perfect she nearly sobbed with relief. She hadn't realised how deeply she'd been craving not just food, but food prepared with care, presented with kindness. "Where did this come from?" she asked between careful bites, still hardly believing the feast was real. "The kitchens." "How did you get them to prepare something this elaborate, and how did they know to bring it here?" She gestured to the silver service, the fine linens, the obvious care taken in presentation. "This looks like food for nobles." Adrian's smile turned mysterious. "I asked politely." "Asked who? The kitchen staff don't take requests from people like us." "People like us?" "Common people. Servants. People without titles or gold to spend." Lyra studied his face in the candlelight, noting again the aristocratic bone structure, the confident way he held himself, the quality of his simple clothes. "Though I'm beginning to think you're not as common as you pretend to be." "What makes you say that?" "The books, this food, the way you speak, like someone accustomed to being heard, the way you move, like you've never had to make yourself small or invisible." She met his golden gaze directly. "Who are you really? Adrian?" For a moment something unreadable flickered across his features. Then servants appeared as if summoned by invisible signals, bowing as they cleared the empty tray and dishes. Lyra watched in amazement as they treated Adrian with obvious deference, their movements careful and respectful in a way that spoke of long practice. "Your law," one began, but Adrian cut him off with a subtle gesture. "Thank you, Marcus, that will be all." The servants withdrew with more bowing, leaving Lyra staring at Adrian with new understanding beginning to dawn. "They know you, really know you, and that man almost called you—" "Called me what?" Adrian's voice held gentle amusement, but his golden eyes watched her face carefully. "I don't know. You're Lord something, like a title." She studied his expression, seeing confirmation in the slight tightening around his eyes. "You're noble, aren't you? That's how you got rare books and elaborate feasts. That's why servants bow to you." "Does it matter?" "Of course it matters. I've been talking to you like we were equals, like I had any right to speak freely to someone important." Horror flooded through her. "I should have recognised quality when I saw it. I should have shown proper respect." "Stop." Adrian leaned forward, his voice holding quiet command. "Don't you dare diminish yourself because you've discovered I have a title. Don't you dare start bowing and scraping like I'm somehow worth more than you because of accident of birth." "But you are worth more. That's how the world works." "Is it?" His golden eyes held hers intently. Here in this library, reading poetry by candlelight, sharing thoughts about beauty and bravery and impossible dreams, what made those conversations valuable? My bloodline or the connection between two people who understand each other? Lyra stared at him, caught between everything she'd been taught about social order and the magnetic pull she felt toward this man who spoke to her like her thoughts mattered. "I have duties," Adrian continued softly. "Responsibilities that keep me busy most hours of most days. But these past 3 evenings, thinking about returning here, anticipating our conversations, they've been the best part of my week. Not because I was graciously lowering myself to speak with a servant, but because I was looking forward to seeing someone who makes me remember why poetry exists." The admission hung between them like a bridge, and Lyra felt something golden and warm unfurling in her chest. "You really mean that?" "I really mean that." His smile was devastating in its sincerity. "Will you still come here, knowing I'm more than I first appeared? Will you still speak freely, share your thoughts, let me watch you discover new books?" The castle bells began chiming midnight, their bronze voices echoing through stone corridors. Adrian rose reluctantly, and Lyra felt panic flutter in her throat at the thought of him leaving. "Will I see you tomorrow?" The question escaped before she could stop herself, vulnerable and hopeful in the intimate darkness. Adrian paused at the alcove entrance, turning back with a smile that sent warmth cascading through her entire body. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away." After his footsteps faded into silence, Lyra sat surrounded by precious books and the lingering scent of cedar pressing her hand to her racing heart. Whatever Adrian's title, whatever his real position in the world beyond this sanctuary, one thing had become impossibly clear. She was falling for him, and for the first time in her life she was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, someone might be falling for her too. Lyra climbed the winding stairs to her sanctuary with lighter steps than she'd carried in years. 4 evenings had passed since Adrian's promise about wild horses, 4 magical nights of conversation and shared poetry, and the growing certainty that something impossible was happening between them. Tonight she'd brought wildflowers from the castle gardens, picked in secret to brighten their alcove. The flowers scattered from nerveless fingers when she reached the library's main floor. Armed guards in royal livery stood at rigid attention throughout the great hall, their presence transforming the familiar space into something foreign and intimidating. Steel gleamed in the torchlight, and every face held the stone-carved seriousness of men preparing for war. "You there!" a commanding voice called sharply. "Halt!" Lyra froze as a stern-faced captain approached, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. Behind him, more guards moved with purposeful efficiency, their boots echoing against stone in perfect synchronization. "State your business in this wing," the captain demanded. I was just..." Lyra's voice came out as barely a whisper. "I work here, in the castle. I was returning something to the library." "All servants have been dismissed from this area. His Majesty requires privacy for royal business." His Majesty. The words hit her like physical blows. Lyra's mind reeled as understanding crashed over her in devastating waves. Adrian had mentioned duties and responsibilities, had spoken of leadership and loneliness. The servants who'd bowed so deeply, the ease with which he procured rare books and elaborate feasts, the quality clothes disguised as simple garments. "His Majesty will see you immediately," the captain continued, and Lyra realised with growing horror that this wasn't coincidence. They'd been looking for her specifically. The throne room had never seemed so vast or intimidating as it did when the massive doors swung open to reveal Adrian seated upon the midnight throne. But it wasn't Adrian anymore. Not really. This man wore the weight of absolute authority like armour, every line of his powerful frame speaking of command and conquest. The golden crown resting on his dark hair caught torchlight and threw it back like captured sunlight, and those familiar golden eyes now held the depth of someone responsible for thousands of lives. "Your Majesty," Lyra whispered, dropping into the deepest curtsy she could manage. Her legs shook so badly she nearly collapsed, and humiliation burned through her chest like acid. All those evenings of easy conversation, of feeling seen and valued and cherished, all of it had been lies. "Guards, leave us." Adrian's voice carried absolute authority, the tone of someone accustomed to instant obedience. "Sire, protocol requires—" "Now." The single word sent every armed man filing from the throne room with practised efficiency. Heavy doors closed with finality that echoed through the cavernous space, leaving them alone in a silence that felt suffocating. Adrian rose from the throne and began walking toward her, but Lyra scrambled backward, panic clawing at her throat. "Don't! Please, Your Majesty, I understand now. I understand what I've done wrong." "Lyra, I should never have spoken to you as an equal, should never have shared my thoughts or opinions or complained about my life like it mattered. I should have recognized quality and shown proper respect." Tears burned her eyes, but she forced them back. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for the presumption." "Stop." Adrian's voice held quiet command, but she was too lost in shame to obey. "You were amusing yourself with the ignorant servant girl, and I was too stupid to realize it. Too desperate for attention to see that someone like you could never truly care about someone like me." The words poured out like poison from a festering wound. Was it entertaining, watching me make a fool of myself, seeing how pathetically grateful I was for scraps of kindness? "Lyra, that's enough." Adrian had closed the distance between them, and now he reached for her hands with familiar gentleness. "Look at me." But she jerked away from his touch, backing against a pillar with wild eyes. "Don't touch me. Kings don't touch servants, and I won't be your plaything any more." Something flashed across Adrian's face, hurt so raw and genuine that it stopped her retreat cold. For a moment the crown and throne and royal authority fell away, leaving only the man she'd fallen in love with, staring at her with devastated golden eyes. "I never lied to you," he said quietly. "Not once. I'm still the man who finds peace in that library corner. Still the man who thinks you're extraordinary. Still the man who—" "Who what? Who enjoys slumming with servant girls for entertainment?" Bitterness twisted through her voice. "How many others have there been? How many silly maids have you charmed with poetry and pretty words?" Adrian's expression shifted, becoming something cold and dangerous that reminded her exactly who she was speaking to. When he spoke, his voice held barely leashed fury, but she realized with shock that the anger wasn't directed at her. "There have been no others. There has never been anyone else who made me forget my duties existed. Never anyone else who made me count hours until I could steal away from council meetings and royal obligations." He stepped closer, and she found herself trapped between his intensity and the stone pillar. "Do you think I make a habit of abandoning my responsibilities to read poetry with random women? Do you think rare books and royal feasts are gifts I distribute casually?" "Then why?" The question broke from her throat like a sob. "Why me? What game are you playing?" "No game." Adrian's voice gentled, and he slowly raised his hands to cup her face with infinite care. "I felt it the moment I saw you in that alcove. Something I'd never experienced before, something that made my heart recognize what it had been searching for without knowing." "Felt what?" "The bond." His thumbs brushed across her cheekbones, wiping away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "The connection that tells an alpha when he's found his mate." The words hit her like lightning, impossible and overwhelming. "Your mate? But I'm nobody. I'm nothing. Kings don't mate with servants." "You are not nothing." Adrian's voice held fierce conviction. "You never were. I concealed my identity because I needed to know if you could care for Adrian the man, not the crown. Needed to know if what I felt was real or just the desperation of a lonely king. And now you know I'm too common, too broken, too— Now I know you're perfect." The interruption was soft but absolute. "Now I know you see my soul when everyone else sees only power. Now I know that everything I felt was real." Before she could respond, urgent footsteps echoed through the throne room. A messenger burst through the doors without ceremony, his face pale with panic. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, but urgent news from the northern border." The man dropped to one knee, breathing hard from his desperate ride. "King Aldric's forces have taken hostages from the border villages. They demand you present yourself alone for single combat, or they'll begin executing prisoners." Ice flooded Lyra's veins. "Emma," she whispered. "My stepsister Emma was visiting the northern villages with the merchant caravan." Adrian's expression turned deadly. "How many hostages?" 15, sire, including several young women who matched the description you gave us to watch for." "Ready my armies. Adrian commanded, already moving toward the doors. "Full mobilization within the hour. Send word to our allies that we ride for war." "Adrian, wait." Lyra caught his arm without thinking, then flinched as she realized her presumption. "Your Majesty, I mean. I'm sorry. I shouldn't—" "Don't!" His hand covered hers where it rested on his forearm. "Never apologize for touching me. Never. Emma is the only family member who ever showed me kindness. She's gentle, scared of violence, barely 18. If something happens to her because of this war—" "Nothing will happen to her." Adrian's voice held absolute certainty. "I swear to you on my crown and my life, I will bring your sister home safely. But if you're walking into a trap—" "I'm not walking into anything. I'm riding with 500 of the finest warriors in the kingdom." His golden eyes held hers intently. "But when this is over, when the threat is ended and your sister is safe, we need to talk. About us. About what this bond means. About the future." The future. The word hung between them like a promise and a question, laden with possibilities that both terrified and thrilled her. Adrian was offering something impossible, a life beyond survival, beyond hiding, beyond believing herself worthless. "Come back alive," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. It was the first admission that she cared about his survival, that the thought of losing him created a pain too deep to bear. Something blazed in Adrian's golden eyes at her words. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her palm that sent heat racing through her entire body. "Wild horses couldn't keep me from returning to you," he murmured against her skin. "When this is finished, I'm coming back to that library alcove. Will you be there?" Lyra nodded, unable to trust her voice. She watched him stride from the throne room with regal authority, already transforming from the gentle man she'd fallen in love with into the warrior king his people needed. But before he disappeared through the doors, he turned back one final time. "Lyra," he called, his voice carrying across the vast space. "What I said about the bond, about you being my mate, I meant every word. Crown or no crown, king or common man, you are mine. You've always been mine." The doors closed behind him with thunderous finality, leaving Lyra alone in the throne room with the echo of his declaration and the terrifying certainty that everything had changed. The man she'd fallen in love with was the Alpha King. He'd claimed her as his mate before witnesses, and now he was riding into battle, carrying her heart with him into an unknown fate. She pressed her fingers to the spot where his lips had touched her palm and whispered into the silence, "Then come back to me, my king. Come back and tell me what forever looks like." 5 days of agonizing silence stretched between Adrian's departure and the victory bells that rang across the kingdom like thunder. 5 days of Lyra haunting the castle battlements, watching the horizon for signs of returning armies. 5 days of believing that loving him might have been the last mistake she'd ever make. When the great gates finally swung open to reveal Adrian riding at the head of his victorious forces, Lyra's knees nearly gave out with relief. He was alive, whole, scanning the courtyard crowds with those golden eyes she'd fallen in love with. Behind him, wagons carried rescued hostages, including Emma, pale but unharmed, clutching a soldier's cloak around her shoulders. But even as joy flooded through her at the sight of his safe return, reality crashed back with brutal force. During his absence, her step-family had discovered her involvement with the king. What had begun as whispered speculation among castle staff had somehow reached Lady Cordelia's ears, and her stepmother had wasted no time in transforming rumour into opportunity. "Lyra, darling," Lady Cordelia had purred, just hours after the victory bells, her voice dripping with false affection. "Why didn't you tell us about your understanding with His Majesty? We could have been so much more helpful in arranging things properly." The lie had spread like wildfire through noble circles. By evening the story had transformed into something unrecognisable, that the clever Blackwood family had orchestrated a match between their ward and the king, that Lyra's presence in court had been carefully planned strategy rather than accidental discovery. Now, as the royal celebration feast filled the great hall with music and laughter, Lyra felt the weight of every noble gaze upon her. She'd borrowed Emma's finest dress, a simple blue gown that marked her as hopelessly common among the silk and jewels surrounding her. Whispers followed her movements like poisonous shadows. "Look, there she is, the servant girl who caught a king." How calculating, making herself available in all his favourite haunts. The family must be delighted, such a profitable arrangement. Though really, she's quite plain for a royal mistress. Each comment landed like a physical blow, confirming every terrible thing Lyra had ever believed about her worthlessness. She tried to make herself invisible against the wall, but escape proved impossible when Lady Cordelia rose from her seat at the high table. "Your Majesty," her stepmother's voice rang across the hall with theatrical warmth. "We are so honoured that you would consider our dear Lyra, though of course we worry she's rather common for a king of your stature." The great hall fell silent as every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Lyra felt heat flood her face as hundreds of eyes turned toward her, some curious, others openly mocking. She wanted to run, to disappear, to sink through the stone floor and never emerge. Adrian entered the hall at that exact moment, resplendent in royal ceremonial armour that caught torchlight and threw it back like captured starfire. The golden crown rested on his dark hair with natural authority, and when his eyes swept the room, every noble present felt the weight of absolute power. But when his gaze found Lyra pressed against the wall in her borrowed dress, everything else fell away. She saw his expression shift from regal composure to something fierce and protective as he took in her obvious distress and the circle of sneering nobles surrounding her. "Lady Cordelia," Adrian's voice carried across the vast space with quiet danger. "You seem to have something to say about my personal affairs." "Oh, Your Majesty, simply expressing our gratitude for the honour you show our family. Though we do hope dear Lyra understands the temporary nature of royal attentions." The insult hung in the air like a blade, and Lyra felt something die inside her chest. Even her own step-family couldn't imagine that someone like her might be worthy of genuine love rather than fleeting lust. Adrian began walking toward her with predatory grace, ignoring the sea of bowing nobles that parted before him. Protocol demanded he acknowledge the high table first, speak with important allies, accept formal congratulations for his victory. Instead, he moved through the crowd like a man with singular purpose. "Your Majesty," Lyra whispered when he stopped directly in front of her. "You should greet the important guests first. I'm not—" "Lyra," he said clearly, loudly enough for every person in the hall to hear. "Would you do me the honour of dancing?" The request sent shock ripples through the assembled nobles. Kings danced with duchesses, with foreign princesses, with women whose bloodlines could be traced back centuries. They did not ask servant girls to partner them in front of the entire court. "I don't know how," she admitted in a voice barely above a whisper. "I've never learned the royal dances. Everyone will see me make mistakes." "Then we'll make our own dance," Adrian said, extending his hand with infinite patience. "Just for us." Trembling, Lyra placed her fingers in his and allowed him to lead her onto the centre of the great hall. The space cleared around them as if by magic, creating an intimate circle, while hundreds watched from the shadows beyond. What followed wasn't a formal court dance with prescribed steps and rigid choreography. Instead, Adrian drew her close and began a simple swaying movement that required nothing but trust. His hand rested warm and steady on her waist, their joined fingers creating a connection that felt more precious than any crown jewel. As they moved together in the golden torchlight, Adrian began to speak. Not in whispers, meant for her ears alone, but in a clear, carrying voice that reached every corner of the vast hall. "This woman has more grace in her smallest gesture than armies have in victory," he said, spinning her gently as gasps echoed from the watching crowd. "More courage in her quietest moment than courtiers have in their grandest speeches?" Lyra's breath caught as she realized what he was doing. This wasn't just a dance. It was a public claiming, a declaration before witnesses that would change everything. "Your Majesty," she whispered, but he continued speaking to the hall. "She reads poetry by candlelight not for show, but for the pure love of beauty. She sees my soul when everyone else sees only a crown. She makes me remember why kingdoms exist, not for the glory of kings, but for the protection of precious things." He turned toward Lady Cordelia and her family, his voice taking on an edge that made strong men step backward. "You claim credit for arranging this match. You're mistaken. Her heart was never yours to give. It was given freely, without calculation or ambition, to a man she believed was nothing more than Adrian." A collective gasp ran through the assembled nobles as understanding dawned. The king hadn't been pursuing a strategic alliance or temporary amusement. This was something far more dangerous and wonderful, genuine love. "She could have chosen safety and invisibility," Adrian continued, pulling Lyra closer as the dance slowed to almost stillness. "Could have hidden her light rather than risk judgment from people who wouldn't recognize true worth if it was wrapped in silk and presented with royal decree. Instead, she chose to trust, chose to be vulnerable, chose to believe that maybe, just maybe, someone might see her value." Now he spoke directly to Lyra, but his voice still carried to every listening ear. "You asked me once what the future looks like. It looks like morning conversations over shared books, like someone who challenges me to be worthy of the crown I wear, like a queen who rules not through bloodline, but through the strength of her own extraordinary heart." With movements that felt like ritual, Adrian reached into his doublet and withdrew his personal signet ring. Not the formal seal of office, but the ring that had belonged to his father and grandfather before him. The ring that marked not just royal authority, but family legacy. "This isn't a claim of ownership," he said, taking her trembling hand and sliding the ring onto her finger. "It's a promise. When you're ready, if you choose me, this kingdom becomes yours, not through marriage to a king, but through recognition of a queen." The great hall erupted into celebration as the meaning became clear to every watching noble. This wasn't political manoeuvring or royal whim. The Alpha King had found his mate, and he was choosing love over convention, heart over strategy. Lady Cordelia's face had gone ash pale as she realized her mockery had transformed into public humiliation. The nobles who'd whispered cruel comments now bowed deeply, suddenly eager to court favour with their future queen. But Lyra saw none of it. Her world had narrowed to Adrian's golden eyes and the weight of ancient gold on her finger, and the impossible truth that someone extraordinary, truly saw her as worthy of forever. "Not as a claim," he repeated softly, for her ears alone, "but as a promise. The choice is yours, Lyra. It will always be yours." Looking up into his beloved face, seeing the sincerity blazing in his golden eyes, feeling the solid warmth of his hands holding hers, before hundreds of witnesses, Lyra realized she had stopped running. For the first time in her life, she was ready to choose belonging over survival. "Yes," she whispered, the word carrying more weight than royal pronouncements or wedding vows. "Yes to the promise, yes to the future, yes to choosing you." Adrian's smile could have lit the entire kingdom as he spun her once more in their private dance, and the great hall filled with cheers that seemed to shake the very stones of the castle. But in the centre of it all, surrounded by celebration and witnesses and the weight of destiny, two people who had found each other in a hidden library corner finally claimed their forever. 3 weeks had passed since the night Adrian claimed her before the entire court, 3 weeks of living in a dream that felt too beautiful to be real. Lyra had been given chambers befitting a future queen, with silk tapestries and windows that overlooked the royal gardens. Servants bowed when she passed. Nobles sought her favour with carefully crafted smiles. The world had transformed around her overnight. But tonight, as golden sunset painted the castle walls, she found herself climbing the familiar winding stairs to the library alcove where everything had begun. Some habits, it seemed, were too precious to abandon even when life offered grander alternatives. The ancient sanctuary looked exactly as it had that first evening. Dusty tomes creating walls of safety, candles flickering in their makeshift holders, the small bench where Adrian had sat and listened to her dreams. Here, surrounded by poetry and shadows, she could think clearly about the impossible choice that lay before her. Adrian's ring caught candlelight as she turned it nervously on her finger. The weight of it still surprised her, not just the physical heaviness of ancient gold, but the meaning it carried. Promise, he'd called it, when you're ready, if you choose me. I wondered if I might find you here. His voice came from the alcove entrance, warm and familiar and patient as always. Lyra looked up to see Adrian silhouetted against the corridor's torchlight, but tonight he wore simple clothes again, the dark tunic and plain breeches that reminded her of the man she'd first fallen in love with. "May I join you?" he asked, exactly as he had that first evening. "It's your castle," she said softly. "You don't need permission." "I do from you." Adrian settled onto the bench with fluid grace, careful to leave space between them. "Here, in this place that's ours, I'll always ask permission." Something in her chest loosened at his words. After 3 weeks of protocol and formality, and people treating her like precious glass that might shatter if handled roughly, his simple courtesy felt like coming home. "Are you having second thoughts?" The question was gently asked, without pressure or expectation, just genuine concern for her happiness. Lyra turned the ring again, watching light dance across its engraved surface. "Not about you, never about you, but about everything else, about whether I can really become what you need me to be." "What do you think I need you to be?" "A queen, someone worthy of a crown, capable of ruling beside you, sophisticated enough for court politics and state dinners and diplomatic negotiations." The words tumbled out in a rush. Someone who doesn't hide in library corners when the world gets overwhelming. Adrian was quiet for a long moment, golden eyes studying her face in the candlelight. When he spoke, his voice held the same conviction that had first made her believe she might be worth loving. "Do you know what I was like before I found you in this alcove?" Lyra shook her head, and Adrian's expression grew distant as he looked into memories she couldn't see. Dutiful, efficient, alone. His voice carried quiet pain. "I attended council meetings and signed treaties and made decisions that affected thousands of lives, but I felt like I was sleepwalking through my own existence, going through the motions of being king without remembering why any of it mattered." He leaned forward, hands clasped between his knees as he continued. "I was good at the crown, Lyra, good at strategy and diplomacy and projecting strength when strength was needed, but I was half a king because I'd forgotten that kingdoms exist to protect something precious. And now I remember." His golden eyes found hers with devastating intensity. "You don't complete me. That's not fair to either of us. But you challenge me to be worthy of completion myself. You make me want to be the kind of king who deserves the crown, not just the one who inherited it." Lyra felt tears prick at her eyes. "What if I'm not strong enough? What if I make mistakes that hurt people or embarrass you or—" "Stop." Adrian's voice held gentle command. "Lyra, look at me." When she raised her eyes to his, she found them blazing with conviction that took her breath away. "3 weeks ago, you watched me ride into battle and whispered, 'Come back alive like my life mattered to you. Not my crown or my power or what I could give you, just me.' Do you have any idea how precious that is to someone who's never been loved for anything except his title?" "Of course your life matters to me," she whispered. "You matter to me. And you matter to me. Not because you're perfect, or because you never make mistakes, or because you were born knowing how to navigate court politics. His hand found hers, fingers intertwining with familiar warmth. You matter because when you look at me, you see Adrian first and King second. Because you choose kindness even when the world is cruel. Because you find beauty in forgotten places and make everyone around you remember why beauty matters. The truth in his voice was undeniable, and Lyra felt something golden and warm unfurling in her chest. The same sensation she'd experienced that first night, but stronger now, more certain. "I'm terrified," she admitted in a voice barely above a whisper. "So am I." The confession surprised her, and Adrian's smile turned rueful. Terrified of being the king you deserve, terrified of building a kingdom worthy of your heart, terrified that I might not be strong enough to protect everything you make me want to become. His honesty broke something open inside her, some last wall she'd been holding against hope. "You really mean that? I really mean that." Adrian lifted their joined hands and pressed a kiss to her palm, exactly as he had before, riding to war. "I was half a king until I found you. You don't complete me. You inspire me to complete myself." The distinction mattered more than she'd expected. Not someone to fill an empty space in his life, but someone to encourage him toward becoming his best self. Not a burden to be protected, but a partner to be cherished. "The choice is still yours," he continued softly. "It will always be yours. If you need more time, if you want to wait, if you decide this life isn't what you want, I'll understand. I'll wait. However long you need, I'll wait." But as he spoke, Lyra realized with startling clarity that she was done waiting, done hiding, done believing she had to earn love through perfection instead of claiming it through courage. "Adrian," she whispered, and something in her tone made his eyes sharpen with attention. "I don't want to run any more." "What do you want?" The question hung between them like a bridge, and Lyra felt herself stepping onto it with steady feet. "I want to stop believing I'm not enough. I want to choose love over fear. I want to build something beautiful with you. And if you make mistakes, if court life overwhelms you sometimes, if there are days when you need to escape to library corners, then I'll make mistakes and feel overwhelmed and escape to corner," she said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "And you'll love me anyway, because you see something in me that I'm finally starting to see in myself." Adrian's smile could have lit the entire kingdom. "And what's that?" "Someone worth choosing, someone worth loving, someone worth the risk of forever." Before she could lose her courage, Lyra leaned forward and kissed him. Not the gentle, hesitant touches they'd shared before, but with the desperate certainty of someone who'd finally stopped running toward safety and started running toward love. Adrian responded with equal intensity, his arms coming around her like he'd been waiting his entire life for this moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, his forehead rested against hers in the flickering candlelight. "Yes," she breathed against his lips. "Yes to choosing this. Yes to choosing us. Yes to choosing home." "Then stay," he whispered, echoing words from what felt like a lifetime ago. "When morning comes, when we leave this sanctuary, when we face whatever challenges wait in the world outside, stay. Choose this. Choose us. Choose home." "I'm staying," she promised, and felt something settle into place in her chest like a key turning in a long-locked door. "I'm choosing you. I'm choosing us. I'm choosing home." Adrian gathered her closer, and they sat surrounded by books and candlelight and the golden certainty that some sanctuaries were worth leaving when they led to something even more precious. Some hiding places were meant to be temporary shelters on the way to building real homes. "I love you," he murmured against her hair, and the words felt like benediction. "I love you too," she whispered back, no longer afraid to claim the happiness that had found her in the shadows and followed her into the light. When Adrian finally carried her from their library sanctuary toward his chambers, toward their future, toward the life they would build together. Lyra looked back once at the alcove where everything had begun. Tomorrow she would face crown fittings and wedding plans and the 1,000 details of becoming queen. But tonight she was simply a woman who had finally learned the difference between surviving and living, between hiding and belonging, between being chosen and choosing to stay. And she would never run again. The morning of their wedding dawned with golden sunlight streaming through the library's high windows, painting everything in warm honey hues. Lyra had insisted on holding the ceremony in the place where they'd first found each other, surrounded by the books and candles that had witnessed their love story unfold. No grand cathedral or throne room could compare to the intimate sanctuary where Adrian had first seen her soul. Emma helped her into the simple ivory gown they'd chosen together, silk that flowed like water but without the elaborate beadwork and towering headpieces that royal tradition demanded. Instead, Lyra wore wildflowers in her hair and carried a bouquet of the same blooms she'd been gathering that first night when Adrian changed her world forever. "You look radiant," Emma whispered, tears sparkling in her eyes. "Mother would have loved seeing you this happy." "She would have loved Adrian too," Lyra replied, touching the simple pearl necklace that had been her mother's. "He sees magic in ordinary things, just like she did." The ceremony itself felt like poetry made manifest. Adrian waited for her among the towering shelves, wearing midnight blue velvet that made his golden eyes luminous. And when she walked toward him past rows of rescued nobles and castle staff, his smile made her forget that anyone else existed in the world. They had written their own vows, words drawn from the verses they'd shared during those magical evenings of discovery. Adrian spoke first, his voice carrying clearly through the intimate space. "Lyra, you found me in shadows and taught me to step into light. You showed me that kingdoms exist not for the glory of kings, but for the protection of precious hearts like yours. I promise to love you not because you complete me, but because you inspire me to complete myself. I promise to see your worth even when you forget it, to choose patience when fear makes you run, and to build with you a love worthy of the poetry we both cherish." When Lyra spoke her vows, her voice grew stronger with each word. "Adrian, you gave my crown purpose and my kingdom a heart. You taught me the difference between surviving and living, between hiding and belonging. I promise to choose courage over comfort, to trust love over fear, and to remind you always that you are worthy of the crown not because of royal blood, but because of the generous heart that beats beneath it." The moment they were pronounced husband and wife, the library filled with gentle celebration that felt nothing like the grand royal weddings of tradition. Instead of hundreds of political allies, they were surrounded by people who had witnessed their journey. Emma beaming through happy tears, castle staff who had watched their love grow, rescued villagers who understood that their new queen was someone who would fight for forgotten people in forgotten places. 6 months later, Lyra stood in the royal gardens, watching Adrian read to a group of village children who had come to the castle for the monthly literacy programme she'd established. Afternoon sunlight caught in his dark hair as small voices giggled at his dramatic interpretation of fairy tale voices, and she felt her heart swell with contentment that still surprised her with its intensity. "Your Majesty!" a young maid approached with careful courtesy. "The Council of Ladies requests your presence at the planning meeting for the Harvest Festival." "Tell them I'll be there shortly," Lyra replied, but her attention remained on Adrian as he caught her watching and winked conspiratorially over the children's heads. The past months had transformed not just her life, but the very culture of the castle. The rigid formalities that had once governed royal existence had given way to something warmer, more inclusive. Servants were encouraged to speak their minds respectfully. The libraries had been expanded and open to anyone seeking knowledge. Elaborate feasts now included places for those who worked in kitchens and stables alongside those who ruled provinces. That evening, in their private chambers, Lyra curled against Adrian's chest in the window seat they'd had built to recreate their old library alcove. Books surrounded them, candles flickered on nearby tables, and the familiar comfort of shared reading filled the space between them. "The council wants to discuss establishing schools in every major village," Lyra said, her head resting on his shoulder as she turned pages of kingdom census reports. "And what did you tell them?" "That education should be a right, not a privilege, that children shouldn't have to hide in forgotten corners to find books." She smiled up at him. "They're learning to appreciate a queen who was once a servant girl hiding in libraries." Adrian's arm tightened around her waist. "They're learning to appreciate a queen who remembers where she came from and uses that understanding to build something better." It was true. The nobles who had once whispered cruel comments about the servant girl who court a king now sought her counsel on matters of policy, had come to understand that her perspective from the shadows gave her insights they'd never possessed. She'd proven herself not through bloodline or political manoeuvring, but through genuine care for the people their kingdom was meant to protect. "Do you ever miss it?" Adrian asked softly. "The simplicity of before, when it was just us and poetry and no responsibilities beyond our own hearts?" Lyra considered the question seriously, thinking of those magical evenings when the world had consisted only of candlelight and conversation and the growing certainty that she was falling in love. "I miss the discovery," she said finally, "that feeling of uncovering something precious and unexpected. But Adrian, we're still discovering each other, still finding new ways to fit together, new dreams to build, new corners of forever to explore." She shifted to face him more fully, studying the beloved features that had become home to her. "Besides, now instead of just reading about brave people doing impossible things, we get to be them." Adrian's smile was devastating in its tenderness. "What impossible thing are we doing?" "Loving each other across every difference the world said should separate us. Building a kingdom where worth is measured by heart instead of heritage. Proving that some fairy tales are actually just prophecies, waiting for the right people to make them real." He kissed her then, soft and reverent, and she marvelled, as always, at how perfectly they fit together. When they broke apart, Adrian rested his forehead against hers in the gesture that had become their own private language. "I have something to tell you," he murmured, golden eyes dancing with mischief. "Should I be worried?" "That depends. How do you feel about tiny versions of ourselves running around the castle gardens?" Lyra's breath caught as understanding dawned. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying that our love story is about to include a new chapter, one that starts approximately 7 months from now." Joy exploded through her chest like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "A baby?" "Our baby," Adrian confirmed, gathering her closer as happy tears spilled down her cheeks. "A little person who will grow up knowing they're loved unconditionally, who will have access to all the books in the kingdom, who will never doubt their worth or wonder if they belong." That night, as they lay entwined in their marriage bed planning nurseries and baby names and all the ways they would love their child, Lyra reflected on the impossible journey that had brought them here. From a broken girl hiding in shadows to a beloved queen carrying the future heir of the kingdom. It was the kind of transformation that belonged in fairy tales. But fairy tales, she had learned, were just stories about ordinary people who chose love over fear, courage over comfort, hope over despair. Stories about recognizing magic when it appeared in unexpected places and being brave enough to claim it. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness, the words as natural now as breathing. "I love you too," Adrian replied, his voice heavy with approaching sleep. "My queen, my heart, my home." In the morning she would wake to sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked gardens where their child would someday play. She would rise to a day filled with royal duties and kingdom responsibilities and the 1,000 beautiful complications of a life lived in service to something greater than herself. But tonight, surrounded by love and possibility and the golden certainty that she would never run again, Lyra drifted off to sleep with poetry on her lips and forever in her heart. She had found her sanctuary not in hidden corners, but in choosing to stay, in choosing to trust, in choosing to believe that even broken girls who read by candlelight could become queens who ruled with wisdom born of compassion, and she would never run again.